Welcome to the System Design and Management webinar series. The System Design and Management program is a mid-career master's degree program that's jointly offered by MIT School of Engineering and the MIT Sloan School of Management. The System Design and Management program provides a systems thinking perspective that integrates management, technology, and social sciences to address rapidly accelerating complexity and change in today's global markets. Graduates earn a Master of Science degree in Engineering and Management. The STM program also offers a one-year certificate in Systems and Product Development. We're pleased today to have Ioannis Kyratzoglou present today on supply chain and risk management. Ioannis is a principal software systems engineer with the MITRE Corporation. He has 30 years of experience in systems engineering and in the acquisition of large-scale software systems. Ioannis has served as a chief engineer, senior technical advisor, and project leader on key projects involving close collaboration with the customer. He's currently responsible for the development of predictive systems performance analytics. Ioannis is an SCRM alumni and holds a Master of Science degree from MIT in Engineering and Management. He also earned a Master of Science in Mechanical Engineering from MIT and a Bachelor of Science degree in Mechanical Engineering from City College of New York. Ioannis will present for approximately 45 minutes. Then we will open up the webinar for questions. Please use the chat feature on the webinar to ask questions, and we'll respond to as many as possible. Please join me in welcoming Ioannis for his talk today.
Thank you very much, Ruben. Welcome, everyone. As Ruben mentioned, my name is Ioannis Kyratzoglou, and what we're going to present today is an empirical analysis of supply chain and risk management for large revenue companies with global footprint. What this topic is all about is it's about managing risk in the supply chain and how companies change their approaches on how to apply risk mitigation strategies. Finally, we're going to present a set of principles and strategies derived out of this study. Okay. Doesn't progress. Thank you. Now let me talk a little bit about the project team and inform you about who was involved. This study was conducted at MIT, and it was sponsored by PricewaterhouseCoopers. This is the European office in the Netherlands. The team was consisted of myself. I was the principal investigator, and it was part of the requirements for the System Design Master of Science thesis. It was conducted under the supervision of Dr. David Simsy-Levy, who is Professor of Engineering Systems right here at MIT. Another person involved in the project was Dr. Kostas Vasiliadis, who was a principal manager with PwC, again, the European office in the Netherlands. Now, what we're going to cover today is being shown on this slide. We're going to talk and provide a little bit of an introduction on risk, supply chain risk. We're going to provide a case study with the Nissan and what happened in 2011. We're going to describe the problem statement, and then we're going to delve into the empirical study as part of this project. We're going to provide some introduction on what is complexity, what is customer value proposition, what do the companies that we study for told us that they are doing. We're going to explain what are the new concepts and principles, like the frameworks that we put together, especially the supply chain and risk maturity framework, and what is the impact of risk disruptions to business performance. Then we'll use that performance that the companies have told us in order to map them against that particular framework. Finally, we're going to talk a little bit about the new principles that may pave the way for a new way of managing risk in the supply chain. And finally, we're going to talk about an online maturity assessment calculator, which is available for every company in order to be able to assess real-time where do they stand in this space. Okay, let me start with a brief introduction into the supply chain risk. Well, my starting point is to emphasize that in the last few years, we observe a significant increase in the supply chain risk. Why? Because of successful implementation of strategies such as lean manufacturing, outsourcing, and offshoring. Well, what lean manufacturing means, lean means low level of inventory. A low level of inventory suggests that if there is a disruption in the supply chain, therefore there is a high probability that the supply may not meet demand in the market. What is offshoring means and outsourcing? Okay, outsourcing means that now your prime contractor has more diverse sources of supply chain partners. Okay, some of these supply chain partners may not be local, may be regional, and some of them may be spread along the globe. Therefore, they're geographically dispersed. This geographic dispersity increases the risk of geopolitical and financial instability in those countries. Like, for example, we may have seen that some of the low labor countries that they are housing supply chain firms, they have labor issues. Okay. Again, outsourcing means that you have outsourced your production to more suppliers far away from your local region. This is as part of, let's say, standardizing your product, and therefore you are able to move a volume of your business to other developers so you can lower your costs. But what we have seen, there are risks. An example of those risks were demonstrated in 2001. Some of those risks were, let's say, the tsunami that happened in Japan, the floods in Thailand that somehow impacted manufacturers, prime contractors, that they were having some of their parts manufactured in those regions. So the bottom line out of this is that there is a risk as part of offshoring, outsourcing, and as part of just-in-time manufacturing that some of these companies have used. Now, you may say, so what? I will buy more insurance. Insurance, if you see that some of these costs that these companies incur can be covered by insurance. But insurance does not cover everything. Insurance covers 30% or maybe 40% of the total cost. But let's say that insurance covers everything, 100%. What am I losing by outsourcing? Well, you run into the risk of losing your brand name. Okay, some of these you may have an impact on your brand name because you're not going to be able to meet the demand, or you may have an impact on your stock performance. Well, insurance cannot cover these areas. So what else? There are other things that may be impacting your company. As you can see, technology has changed today. The development of parts and also the major products has increased the development clock cycles. Parts and products have been produced very fast and are being replaced. Therefore, you may change your strategy from a cost-effective to a flexible one. You have also seen that as part of the outsourcing and global distribution of your supply chain, the number of interfaces between the prime contractor and your supplier and partners have increased. Okay, that gives us a network of nodes and connections that is very geographically dispersed. If a node or a connection is broken, then there is some financial impact on the bottom line of the business. So we need to consider that, and companies that have mature processes they need to take into account those risks and develop new approaches for handling them. So, what are the questions that we need to ask? The questions that we need to ask is what we just mentioned right now. In the face of these supply chain risks, what do companies with global supply footprint do? How do they prepare for it? Well, what are the new ways of systems thinking on how to manage and mitigate those risks? Well, we're going to talk about them in this study. Well, let's bring the discussion about the Nissan case study in order to framework of our topic. Well, as you are aware, Nissan is an automotive company, one of the big three in Japan. The other two are Toyota and Mazda. Well, during the tsunami, during the March 2011, there was Nissan suspended operations as a result of three sources of risks, maybe four, that appear. One is the earthquake, the second is the tsunami that followed the earthquake, and third is the nuclear environmental disaster, plus the other environmental impact as a result of all the three above incidents that happened. What happened to Nissan? Well, 80% of auto plants suspended production after this devastating quake. Out of the big three manufacturers in Japan, Nissan was perceived to be impacted the most. But how did Nissan recover from all this? Well, the recovery was very remarkable. In the 6 months that followed, Nissan production in Japan was down 3.8% compared to an industry total of 24% as a result of the risk incidents. But at the end of the year, they ended up with an increase in production of 9.3%. How was Nissan able to manage successfully such a disruption? How did they protect the brand name? How did they protect their stock performance? What did they do in order to, prior to that, in order to be able to counter those risks that appear? What were their risk mitigation strategies? Well, those are listed in this slide. They deploy advanced capabilities along the supply chain as well the risk management dimension. That means they may have visibility upstream of the supply chain and downstream of the supply chain. They were able to look into the first tier and second tier suppliers and partners, and they were able to understand what was their supply position at the time that the incidents occurred. They used flexibility in the supply chain. That was the plan that they had already, in which they had centralized planning but decentralized execution. Okay. They prepared business continuity plans. They had business continuity plans as a result of this, how to handle these incidents. And they execute them in simulation and training regularly. So their people were already trained on how to perform and how to handle those particular sources of risk. So they were well prepared. What else? They protected those type of actions, protected their brand name. They had a very strong customer value proposition. Okay? That means they had to provide high quality and cost-effective automotive products that enrich people's lives. Those are their customer value propositions. And their customer value proposition was linked to the operation strategy. A couple of operation strategies that Nissan executed was prior to that, it was to balance the manufacturing and sourcing footprint to sales footprint. Essentially what that means, if they had a little bit more regional strategy, not totally a global strategy sourcing from one region. And they were able to reduce the supply chain risk which arises from global production. But what is the lesson learned out of this? The lesson learned out of this and this particular study is not about Nissan. It's about the link between the customer value and the operation strategies. It's about the approaches, the principles, and the risk mitigation methods that someone needs to apply ahead of time in order to be successful in mitigating risk. Having a plan together and being mature is what this study is about. That means what do the companies do in the face of risk? You know very well that what your risks are and what your sources of risks. But what you don't know is what is going to hit you next. So how do you prepare against those risks and be able to mitigate it and reduce the impact when they appear? That's what this study is all about. It's a study about the supply chain operations and risk and the approaches that large revenue companies have with global footprint. So what we have done is we were able to describe the company operations, understand the company operations and financial performance in the face of the supply chain disruption. We have collected that data based on our study. We have employed systems thinking in order to develop a framework. Those are the frameworks and principles that I mentioned before. And these frameworks were able to help us convert those ideas and observations into the operations principles that somehow will help the companies to mitigate their strategies and their impact. And we have developed a number of operational principles, and this is I'm going to present them as we go through the slides in the future at a late part. And here is that our study. Our study was helped a lot by PricewaterhouseCoopers. We have collected data from 209 companies, customers of PricewaterhouseCoopers. And what you see in the upper left corner is the distribution of companies by region. You see that 53% of the companies come from Europe, 31% from the United States, and 16% from Africa and Middle East. Right next to it, you see the distribution of participants by industry, and 31% is our automotive and industrial products. You can see the distribution in your slides. The important thing is that the revenue size of the companies. You can see that 40% of the companies that we receive data and we study are greater than 1 billion. Okay? 40% are greater than 1 billion. The remaining is less than 1 billion. 60% are in the manufacturing sector, and 40% are approximately in the non-manufacturing sector. And some of the demographics. Okay? You can see the global footprint of the companies when 80% of them operate across regions. In the lower hand, you see how the operations and sales volume is distributed by regions. This does not mean that these companies are regional, because you see that their operations and sales are almost equal in each region. It means that their manufacturing may be done elsewhere, but their operations and sales may be in the same region. That gives you an idea of the size of the study and the data that we have used. Now, I have provided an introduction to supply chain risk. Let me also provide some introduction in the complexity associated, because it plays a role on the impact. As I mentioned before, companies are outsourcing and offshoring. Supply chains are geographically dispersed with a lot of interfaces, and therefore they have become more complex. Now, companies, as the data show earlier, they have demand and supply markets that are larger and diverse in different regions. They're not focusing only on Europe, they're not focusing only in the United States, but also all over the world. As I mentioned, product development speeds have changed. Parts are being developed faster than before, and supply chain strategies need to change in order to account for these dynamics. Now, you may want to change from a cost-effective strategy that you use to a more flexible strategy. What is a more flexible strategy? Applying product modularity and standardizations. That means you standardize the system design, and you standardize the process design and the product design. If you do not have product standardization, as you develop your product family, then you have increased the complexity in your supply chain. Okay. And there are other impacts in your supply chain, as you can see, like tax regimes in each country, local environments, geopolitical and financial environments in each country, and technologies. All these aspects are very sensitive to your supply chain and increases their vulnerability. So we ask our companies, what has changed in the last 3 years as part of the complexity in your supply chain? Changes in the complexity increase the risk exposure. To get an indication, we ask that question, and the data that we have collected show us that 95% of the companies told us that the dependencies between the suppliers and the partners have increased. So the prime contractor, as a result of offshoring, has increased, and outsourcing has increased. Changes in the extended supply chain network configuration are happening more frequently. What does that mean? New suppliers are coming up into the space, all suppliers disappearing from the space, there are mergers, and as a result, you have to keep track of what is happening in order to identify what are the critical nodes in your supply chain that have the greater financial impact. New product introduction has become more frequent. We mentioned that earlier, that through the technology, the latest technology and the latest innovation has increased the development clock speed. And therefore, prime contractors have to keep up with those speeds in order to introduce new products into the market. Okay. How do companies deal with that? With the increasing risk and the increasing complexity. We're going to talk about that, as I mentioned, later on. The other question that we ask is about the customer value proposition. We mentioned earlier that there is a link between customer value proposition and operation strategy. This link leads to the development of frameworks, processes, and principles that may tell us how successful mature companies are, the ones that are able to compete in the market. The top 4 choices that our companies told us are quality, and that makes sense, innovation, that keeps them ahead of the competition, price, and brand name. Okay. Those are the 4 top choices. We mentioned about risk. We talk a little bit about complexity. Let us talk a little bit about sources of risk. Okay? These are the things that companies need to monitor in order to be able to respond effectively. Okay, what you see out there is a set of risks. Those are the set of risks that a company should focus on. At the top of the risks, at the top of the list, we have natural disasters, geopolitical problems, epidemics, and at the bottom of the list we have, let's say, market changes, supplier performance, forecast accuracy, execution problems. And you can see that this list is ordered from unknown unknowns to known unknowns. What does that mean, unknown unknowns? Unknown unknowns, like example is natural disaster, geopolitical problems, and epidemics, are sources of risks that we have very little data and as collected, and as a result, is very difficult to predict. We cannot build models. Excuse me. Hold on 1 minute. Can you tell me?
Pardon us 1 second. So for some time.
Thank you. So we have unknown risks. Unknown with the feature with the characteristics with respect to unknown unknowns is that we do not have data collected, and it is very difficult to build models. Examples, as I mentioned, is natural disasters. At the bottom of the list, we have market changes, supplier performance data. These are the known unknowns. These are the risks that we have data, we can forecast, we can build models, and therefore we can control their impact. Whether controllable or uncontrollable risk, a company must be able to put together a supply chain risk management strategy that can effectively deal with that. So how do companies think, or what is their effective strategy in order to be able to deal with those risks? So we ask our companies to tell us what are the risks that were most exposed. Those 209 companies that I mentioned before that told us that the risk which can potentially have the biggest impact in their supply chain are raw material prices, currency fluctuation, market changes, and oil or price changes. Okay? Notice that some of these risks, or those top 4 risks, are somehow controllable risks. I just want to mention that their focus is on controllable risk. Uncontrollable risk, like an earthquake or a tsunami, is very difficult to predict. It may happen once every 50 years. Well, when it happens, of course, the impact is high, so there is a low probability of occurrence, but high impact. However, what these companies telling us that these are the top 4 risks that they're exposed to, and they have the biggest impact on their supply chain. Okay. And then we ask them, okay, what is the risk mitigation strategies that you put together? Okay, how do you deal with that? Well, Nissan, we mentioned a few of them when we discussed the Nissan case. Well, the first one is create and implement a business continuity plan. Well, the business continuity plan has to have these certain features and characteristics so you deal with the right risks. Implement a dual sourcing strategy. Okay, that's a very well-known fact. That means the prime contractor, you must have dual source of suppliers, but not only that, he has to look into what is the sourcing of the first-tier suppliers. So this is very important too. Use both regional and global strategy. Okay, global strategy means long transportation lines. Long transportation lines means high risk, susceptibility as a result of the geographical dispersion. If a node breaks, therefore your supply chain risk is at risk. And pursue a first and second tier collaboration. That means you have to have visibility into the first tier supplier and second tier supplier methods of manufacturing and their practices. So this is what the companies that they told us today do. So again, we talk about risk, we talk about complexity, we talk about sources of risk, we talk about what companies do, but what do successful companies do? Okay, how do they manage successfully and maintain their brand name, they maintain their stock performance, and they're able to meet the supply and demand? Okay. So those are the questions that we need to answer, and the study also answers. How does each company knows where it stands? What are the new ways of thinking to manage their supply chain in the face of this dynamically changed environment? Then they do not have to think only about inventory service level, response time, but right now companies need to take risk into account. So we took the data, we organized them, we had a study team, and as a result of the analysis across two dimensions, the supply chain dimension and the risk management dimension, we were able to develop a risk maturity and supply chain risk maturity framework. This is again what we mentioned before. We collected the data on customer value proposition, on the operational strategies, on the risks, on the complexities, and then use that data and observations to develop frameworks and the approaches, the best approaches that reduce risk. So we develop a risk supply chain and maturity model. Okay, 4 levels. Level 1 is the functional level. Level 2 is the integration. Level 3 is the proactive risk level. And level 4 is the supply chain flexible and adaptive level. Let's describe this level a little bit more and what it means, because there is a lot of data underneath that in order to be able to explain and be able to categorize these companies, because this is the framework that we use in order to understand the quality of each company. At the lower level, we have the functional supply chain and the ad hoc management of risk. That's level 1. Okay, what does that mean? Functional supply chain. That means the supply chain management is being done across functional levels. Okay, there is no cross-functional supply chain collaboration. Product design is independent. There are ad hoc management, ad hoc risk management process. What is ad hoc means? It means that when you have a risk, there are not risk management process in place. There is not risk governance in place. And then when a risk incident occurs, you just pick up the phone and call the expert. Okay? That's what it means. There is only limited vulnerability and risk assessment done, and at this point, essentially, and managing at this level is probably not very cost effective because you may not have optimized your inventory position and your production capacities. The next level is the integrated supply chain management and position of planning and buffers to absorb and optimize position of buffers in order to optimize inventory locations. At this point, you have internal collaboration among the different supply chain channels. Okay, you were able to do anticipation risk planning. That means there is an internal collaboration on how to plan for risk across channels. The supply channels are aligned and integrated, and somehow they have visibility into the upstream and downstream performance of your supply partners and suppliers. And you start collecting data in order to be able to manage and understand the status of the supply chain performance. The third level is the collaborative part. You have an external supply collaboration and proactive risk management. At this point, you're dealing with the external enterprise. You bring in external suppliers and all external partners into the chain in order to be able to manage it effectively. You do proactive risk management. That means you sit down and you do continuously managing the supply chain network in order to see where the risks and the vulnerabilities are. At this point, you have quantitative risk management. And of course, the last stage is the dynamic and flexible, dynamic supply chain adaptation and fully flexible response to risk. Flexible means adaptation to change and changes to demand mix, to market demand changes, and you can, how do you implement flexibility? You can implement flexibility through flexible product design, flexible processes, so on and so forth. So we use this model in order to assess our companies. In this slide, what you see is additional details across the supply chain dimension and risk management dimension. But what is more important is the slide that you just see, the risk maturity model. This model tells us a couple of very important things. We were able to assess the maturity of these companies against risk mitigation strategies. And what you can see there is that 60% of the companies, level 1 and level 2, pay marginal attention to supply chain risk management. This is a very important message. 60% of the companies, they may not even use risk. They may be at level 1, or most of them is at level 2. Only 40% of the company, they told us that they are able to mature, to encounter effectively the risk mitigation across the supply chain. Well, we're going to examine that concept because the bottom line is how much impact was the supply chain risk had on the company's bottom line. That means on the company's key performance parameters. In the meantime, also introduce the concept of mature and immature companies. Mature, we call them the ones that are level 3 and level 4, and immature are the ones that pay marginal attention to risk. So we use this model in evaluating the companies. And here is what we found out. There is a high correlation between those companies that are faced with at least 3 disruptive incidents over the last 12 months and suffer a 3% impact on key performance parameters. In summary, what that chart tells us is that risk had an impact on the financial performance of the companies. 35% of the companies told us that risk impact was high on their market value. 54% of the companies told us that were impacted on their sales revenue by risk. So you can see the impact of risk on the company's performance dimensions. Okay. Next, here is another important principle. In summary, using the model that we just described, level 1 mature companies versus immature companies, level 1 companies and level 2 versus level 3 and level 4 companies. How did companies that have mature risk strategies and government in place perform when you compare them with immature companies. What the data show us is that mature companies were more resilient to supply chain disruptions. Okay, that means they suffer the percentages, and you can see the difference right here on the graph. Only 28% of the companies suffer severe impact on their market value versus 41% of immature companies. That's a 13% difference. Okay, and you can see the correlation. So there is between maturity and performance with respect to companies that have developed risk-mature strategies. That's a very important insight that we need to take away. The other important insight is with flexible companies, companies that have applied flexible operational strategies versus the companies that have applied cost-effective strategies. Cost-effective strategies means that companies, they're investing in inventory, in buffers, positioning at different locations geographically. That's one interpretation. And they have outsourced maybe to low-cost developing countries in order to reduce costs. Flexibility means that companies may have invested in product design and they have high ability to adapt to changes. So what is the takeaway out of this? Again, only 13% of the companies with flexible strategies have absorbed the impact of risk versus 46% of the companies, okay, with cost-effective solutions. Right now we're comparing mature companies in both dimensions, the flexible and the cost-effective dimension. So what we are seeing that companies with flexible operational strategies, mature companies with flexible operational strategies, are more resilient to risk than companies with cost-effective strategy. Thus, investing in flexibility pays off. That's what that tells us. The next one is segmentation, risk segmentation. We are comparing companies that segment their risk strategy versus companies that do not segment their risk strategies. Again, so we're looking at mature companies that have that suffer a 3% or higher impact on their KPIs as a result of more than 3% disruptions facing the last 12 months. Okay. Right. Again, what do we see right here? What does the data tell us? The data tell us that companies that segment their risk are more resilient than companies that do not segment their risk. And look at those deltas. Okay, there's a 44% difference in the percentage of companies along the two dimensions. Those that segment the risk and along those that do not segment the risk. Again, what does that mean? What it means is that companies that pursue risk segmentation are performing better. So 60% of our companies that we study perform risk segmentation. 40%, they do not pursue risk segmentation. They treat risk across all dimensions as one. Companies that segment their strategy across a number of differentiators, like as you see in the right-hand side, like strategic importance is one risk differentiation, demand volatility in the different regions, volume and volume mix, and profit margin, those companies perform better. And there is a correlation across that. And finally, we compare, again, going back to the model that we put together earlier on between mature companies, level 1 and level 2, mature companies, level 3 and level 4, and immature companies, level 1 and level 2. How do those companies perform across both supply chain performance and across financial performance? And you can see what the data says. Mature companies with perform better across all key performance parameters. Okay. Their EBIT margin is higher. The inventory turnover ratios are higher. And the inventory of days of supply are lower. Those are very important takeaways. So in summary, we went across and we look at the risk, we look at the complexity, we look at the sources of risk, we look at the risk mitigation strategies of the companies, and we identify that supply chain disruptions have significant impact on companies' business and financial performance. We validated that information with data. How do successful companies that can protect a brand name, companies that perform well and they protect their stock value, what do those companies do? Even though they don't know what is the source of risk in the next 12 months, what do they do? Well, companies with mature risk processes are more resilient. Therefore, they have sophisticated risk management processes embedded into their corporate culture. What do the companies do with respect to the supply chain flexibility? Those companies are more resilient. They're able to respond to product changes very fast, and they're more resilient to disruption, to technology disruption. Mature companies that are investing along risk segmentation are more resilient than companies that do not invest in risk segmentation. And we brought some examples. Companies with mature capabilities in supply chain and risk management, we found out through data that are performed better along all dimensions of operational and financial performance. These outcomes are not anecdotal. They're not out of gut feeling. They're validated with 209 companies that participated in this study. So this is an empirical study with observations and data that lead to the principles that if you follow these major operational rules and guidelines, you're not guaranteed to outperform the competition, but what is being guaranteed is that you're going to be more resilient in your supply chain risk, and your exposure to risk is going to be, and your impact on risk is going to be, and the effect of the risk is going to be of lower probability. Insurance, this is a very important message to the CEOs and CFOs. Insurance is not a solution. Managing risk and putting effective risk management plans in place are of paramount importance, and you have to think on how to put those plans together in order to be able to protect your brand name, to protect your profit and your financial performance. Finally, we have developed a supply chain risk management maturity assessment calculator. This calculator is being based on the model, the mature model and immature model that I mentioned before, the 60-40% model, that sort of provide you an idea based on the 209 companies that we learn information from, tells you where do you stand. This is a very important message here that tells you this is not to measure where you stand, but where do you stand against your competition. Because if you're not better than your competition, then you have lost your competitive advantage. Now, this particular program is going to be available in the very near future on the website for MIT Forum for Supply Chain Innovation. Here is the URL. Please look for it. Within a month, we're going to be posting. Thank you very much and for participating in this webinar, and I'm ready for your questions.
Thank you very much, Ioannis. I would encourage anybody that has questions to please use the chat feature. We do have one on the system right now. The question from the participant is, how much importance do mature companies give to monitoring weak signals to detect upcoming risks?
That's a very good question. The mature companies, they have developed a network in which themselves they have nodes and connections to the nodes between, and these nodes is a prime, is the prime contractor with the partners, and the prime and the partners with the first-tier suppliers, the second-tier suppliers. Weak signals, the term weak signals implies that you have a quantitative measure in which you monitor the performance on the node and the connection. And right now, what the immature companies do are based on the gut feeling. Sometimes this is correct, and sometimes it's incorrect. Mature companies are able to use certain principles, certain mathematical models, like time to recover, to monitor the market changes in that region and the financial impact that the company, the supply chain company, it has when it goes down, the financial impact on the prime contractor that the financial chain partner will have if it underperforms, and how much money the prime contractor spends on that company. Like, for example, you may have a very cheap part, but that part is very important. However, if that part is being manufactured in a country that it's very far away, or the supplier is going out of business. So mature companies have alerts and notifications, and through continuous management, they're able to have early indicators of what the issues are in order to be able, before it becomes a risk, in order to be able to put together plans and be able, through upstream or downstream visibility, to be able to apply a solution.
Thank you. We've got another question here, and this question is, how many mature companies were using lean manufacturing as their management system model?
This depends on the product. Okay, I would say that there were. I cannot put names, but there are a number of manufacturers in the European sector that they have used lean manufacturing and just-in-time manufacturing in order to meet their customer value proposition, which is fast response. So if I have to put a number, it's approximately 40% of these companies, they're using lean manufacturing strategies in order to be able to build a flexible and responsive strategy.
So the next question we have, What do you think are the primary reasons for level 1 and 2 companies to not build a risk management strategy?
This is a good question. Okay, usually building a risk management strategy, especially for the companies that do not have a global footprint, those are the companies that primarily they do not think about global risks. Second, in order to build a strategy, you have to have a strategy office, risk strategy office, and you have to be embedded within the corporate culture. So introducing such a functional department may be an issue in those companies, especially with the ones that have revenue sales with lower than $1 billion. So we found those reasons that I just mentioned in those companies with that are lower than $1 billion revenue.
And we have another question. Do rival companies join up to mitigate risks that might affect them all as part of their risk mitigating strategy? And then a corollary to that is that similar to non-rival firms? Do we see the same thing?
I do not have data whether rival companies join up the prime contractors in order to mitigate some risk. But I will say that this is probably a strategy approach in areas in which you wanted to whether you have regional strategies, for example, where and your major and your critical components are being developed in certain areas. You can have rival companies join up, but at the end of the day, you have to separate them because the bottom line is profitability, and the bottom line is protecting your brand name and your stock performance. So I do not have data in order to answer this question and validate certainly what are the strategies with respect to how do rival companies collaborate.
At that point, we are actually at our hour. In conclusion, I would love to thank all of you for attending and listening into the webinar. I'd like to remind you that our next webinar is scheduled for Monday, February 10th at 12 o'clock Eastern Time, and that'll be presented by Asif Iqbal on the power of and performance program, on understanding integrated circuit security threats. With that, I'd love to thank you, Ioannis. Thank you very much for your time and the presentation, and we look forward to hearing more about your work.
Thank you very much, Ruby. Thank you for inviting me.
You're very welcome.